I'm Mary Gellhorn, and today is April the 14th, 2016. And I'm talking about my father, Peter Gellhorn, composer, conductor, and pianist. Just my recollections and things that I know about him. I live in Stroud, and I have two teenage boys, and I'm watching a lot of children's football at the moment. But when I was younger, I trained as a dancer, and I worked on stage for about 5 years. I think that was the sort of natural accumulation of growing up in a house that was steeped in the arts. And it was a fun way to travel, and I really loved traveling. Anyway, that career came to an end, and I trained in massage and connective tissue and health and healing the body and craniosacral osteopathy, and that's the job that I do now. I really like it. It's a really great way of working with people and seems to incorporate a lot of the other things that I've done in my life as well. So my father was born in Breslau, and I think 2 years later, or 3 years later, his sister was born, Anneliese, and they lived with their mother. Their mother was a shopkeeper, and she was one of about 7 sisters, I think. His father, Alfred Gellhorn, was a sort of dashing officer in the army, so he wasn't there all the time, and also they had not got married. His friends in the army persuaded him or told him that he really had to marry Elsa to make the children, give the children his name and make a proper thing of it. So he married her, but they never really lived. They might have lived together for a year, if that. That was never really on the cards as far as the father was concerned. So his father moved to Berlin, and life became very difficult. I think Elsa's sisters turned their back on her because she'd had children with a Jew, I think. So when my dad was about 9, they moved to Berlin, where his father lived on one side of Berlin, and they lived on the other side, in Charlottenburg. And he had an aunt, Martha, who was very kind to her sister. And I think it was when they moved to Berlin that my dad, aged 9 or so, began to learn the piano. Or it might have been in Breslau, not sure about that. But I know the 2 early memories he had in Breslau are that they were very poor. And the first time they went on holiday, a charity gave the mother some money. And he remembers walking through a forest and seeing the sea for the first time, which was amazing for him. And the other thing he remembers, he must have been much younger, was his father arriving at Christmas with a parcel wrapped for him. And he unwrapped it, and it was a train. It was a clockwork train, which must have automatically sort of gone off. It sort of exploded in his hands, and he never forgot that. So that was a kind of frightening memory, but he could remember his father coming in his uniform. It must have been from the front, because he was born in 1912, so he was there with his mother on their own during the First World War. Of his time in Berlin, he didn't speak about it very much, but I think it was very hard. He used to walk, his mother was short of money, and so she would send him to his dad to collect the money, and his father would be angry with him and give him a bit of the money. And then he'd cross back to his mother, who would be furious because he'd only got a bit of it. So I don't think it was a really happy childhood, but I think he learned to kind of keep going, and I think the music helped him a lot, and his kindly aunt. And he just loved being in Berlin. I think coming from one town to another, he grew up, but Berlin was such an exciting place at that time. And I think he just loved being there. He always spoke really highly about the people and their sense of humour. So I think that was a happy time, especially as he grew a bit older. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure how he came to start learning the piano. I don't think it was his mother's idea, and I'm not even sure it was his dad, but somebody suggested it, and somebody paid for the lessons, and somebody paid for his tutorial fees at the music school. And I don't know who that was, but I think one of his piano teachers had been a pupil of Clara Schumann. That is the only nugget of solid information that I have, and I don't know the name of that person. But he was helped by people, and I think that has also come through his life. All through his life, there have always been people who've really helped him because of his ability and his ability to share his music when he played or worked on a piece. So those things, some things were really hard. Also, with the other hand, he was given as well. I think as a young man, he did give concerts. I think it was the fashion in Berlin to have soirees and evenings, and I think he did a lot of those. I think the last one he did might have been the one which he performed for the Brown Shirts. And they said, "Oh, you must come back." And he said, "Well, I don't think that's going to be possible." And a horrible hush fell on the room briefly. Yeah, I think that might have been the last time he did that. I think at the time he graduated, there were a lot of good signs that he would have a fantastic career in Berlin. The people he knew and how he'd been treated, and already having a certain degree of work. So I think this book and the political change really pulled the rug from under his feet. And yes, it was difficult being a German in England. And it was also difficult being a Jew, German Jew. But I think, you know, he was quite philosophical about it. He didn't hold grudges. He didn't hold grudges against anybody. And his philosophy was just to get on with the next piece of music. That was what kept him going. I don't think he ever experienced that from normal people in the street. I remember, it just reminds me, there was a comment made by a guard on the Isle of Man who said to one of his mates, "I didn't realise there were so many Jews amongst the Nazis," because he thought all Germans were Nazis. But I think my dad just found that quite humorous. No, I don't think he encountered direct prejudice. At least he never mentioned it. The music at home was always a huge part of family life. My mum was quite a good pianist, violinist and singer, and she really brought us up whilst my dad was busy working. So she would play songs and we'd sing along with her, or she'd accompany us if we were playing things. We did duets. And she made sure that, you know, all of us learnt an instrument, and possibly two, and we all could sing. My dad's music room was at the back of the house, and it was more of a quiet place away from the hurly-burly of family life. And different kind of music really emanated from that room, from really, you know, I must have been a very small child sleeping upstairs, and you could hear the piano and marvellous singers and violinists and all kinds of music sort of coming up through the floorboards. So that was like his music, and then there was always a lot of music. Always a lot of music. And my mum's family was a very keen amateur musician, and her great aunt, I think, was the first woman organist at the Royal College of Organists. So there was, and her aunt was a soloist at the first performance of Elijah, I think. Dream of Gerontius. I think she sang The Angel. So there was kind of high level of music in my mother's family too. And I think that's something they had really very much in common, was this great love of music. Yeah, so it was strong on both sides of the family. Always at Christmas time we had a big family affair, and he always played for the carols without any music, which was, I think, what I first remembered noticing about that. But when I was about 13 or 14, I had piano lessons with him, and he taught me harmony. He said, you can't play the piano if you don't understand harmony. So I had to learn how to write out a figured bass and the rules of harmony. And in the end, I think that kind of put me off when I was about 16. I used to sort of do it quickly at the last minute, and my heart wasn't in it. But yes, the pieces he taught me are the ones that I still can play up to a point. And he played, when I did my violin exam, he played the piano for it. And I can remember that the examiner saying to me, well, that was very well done, and then turning to my dad and saying, well, you weren't bad either, as a joke. I mean, he was obviously much better than, than the normal exam pianist, so yeah. I think he found the music profession quite challenging, and he was reluctant to encourage us to go into it because he thought it was a very difficult profession to succeed in. But my oldest brother did go to the Guildhall School of Music and went to Germany and went to Paris, and he studied music to a very high level. But the rest of, and my sister also sang professionally for a short period, but she's always been very keen to sing. So, and when he conducted our local choir, I used to sing in that choir. And there was, when we did the Ceremony of Carols by Britain, I had a small duet. So I had a little bit of singing with him as well. Yeah, I trained as a dancer. So no one else in the family had been a dancer, so there was no one to compare me to. And I'd always really loved it. So when I was leaving primary school, I took the audition for White Lodge, and I got into the Royal Ballet School for only 1 year because they only selected certain ones. But I always carried on with my dancing. And when I finished my O-levels, then I thought, well, if I'm going to dance, I better, it's a young person's profession, I've got to do it now. And I enrolled for ballet school full-time. And at the end of that, I worked for several years, 5 years professionally. So I had my taste of the bright lights. It was fun. It was hard work as well. But I think when you really enjoy something, it doesn't feel too bad at all. My parents, well, my first job was on the Isle of Man. And I think I was 18 or 19, and my parents came to see me in that show. And that's when I realised that my dad had been to the Isle of Man. I didn't know it before then, so I was nearly 20. It was a kind of modern summer season show, and the music was very loud. And I remember the girls saying to me, well, which ones are your parents? And I said, my dad is the one in the front row with his fingers in his ears. It was quite funny. Too loud for him. But we went up to the north to Ramsey, where he had been before. And I think around that time, in the 70s and the 80s, my dad started to really revisit some of the places that had been important in his life. He had a bit more time. He went back to the place he was born, and he found that his house was still standing in Poland. He said it was very odd to see the Polish signs, because obviously it was Germany when he lived there. He went back to Berlin, and he saw that his house in Berlin was also still standing. And he went to the Isle of Man really to see me, but also because his time there. And my mum, when I was working in Mexico, my mum came to see me, but my dad didn't. I think he kind of, all of us just got on with our lives, and he was still getting on with his, so, yeah. But he had a lot of respect for dancers. He said they worked harder than musicians, and he was always very respectful about it. Mm. He didn't talk about his professional life in the family life at all. He much more talked about politics, or whether the builders had turned up or not. He didn't really like people coming and working in the house. So he yeah, mostly politics. He listened to the news. I think it was a hangover from the war, but on the hour, nearly every hour, he'd just listen to the headlines in case something had happened. But when he was working with people in his music room, he very often would then have them for coffee or have them for tea afterwards. And then we would meet some of the people he worked with and get to know them a little bit. So that's really the only way. He kept it really quite separate, I think. And yeah. I think as a child, I would sometimes know if things weren't quite right, because he would talk to my mum in a separate room, and you'd hear the sort of anxiety levels a little bit. But he didn't really involve the family in it. No, he didn't. I remember meeting Philip Langridge. I remember meeting Jill Gomez. And the thing that really struck us about her, she had this lovely soft furry coat, which we'd never seen anything like it. We were quite small girls then, me and my sister. Maria Lidker would come very often, and he used to do chamber music with her, with Sheridan Russell. There was a school friend of mine, two of my school friends studied with him. One is Hetty Wayne, who works at Glyndebourne now, and the other one, Peter Crockford, who did a lot of work in London and conducting and with opera. George Benjamin came and studied with him, and when he first arrived, he was a schoolboy, I think, and he was at Westminster. I don't know which school he was at. Anyway, he was quite young when he came, and he studied with my dad for 2 or 3 years. And then my dad felt that he couldn't really teach him any further, and he introduced him to Messiaen and took him to France and introduced them, and then George continued his studies with Messiaen. He had somebody... there were names from the past that used to crop up, and you know, when he was at Glyndebourne in the early years, he had Heather Harper and Janet Baker in his chorus, and I think also Edgar Evans he knew from that time. So that used to spark my interest. These were famous people that my dad actually knew, you know. He knew Schwarzkopf, and there's a lot of all his work people he kept quite separate from the family, and so just little bits would filter through of who he had worked with. He was very loyal to the people he worked with, and they were to him, I think. Moira Limpany was somebody else he used to work with. I looked in his very early diaries, and there were certain names that he was still working with when he was 90. Katinka was somebody who sung with him, and then in later years they used to go to visit old people's homes to do concerts. So, you know, that was a lifelong friendship. And also with Schwarzkopf, we went back to Berlin, but he used to, every time it was her birthday, he would play down the piano. He'd play the piano to her down the telephone, so as a sort of birthday gift. There was a singer called Miette Dernbach, who was French, and he knew her all through her life as well. So yes, he had good friendships with the people that he really connected with. Right, so he met Lotte Reiniger when he was still a student in Berlin, and I'm not sure what the situation of it was, but the result was that she commissioned him to make the music for her silhouette films, which I think were the first silhouette films made. I'm not sure about that, but I think so. So she gave him his first professional work, I think. And also she was living in Paris at the time when my dad had to leave Germany. And once he got through the border, he went straight to Lotte's house in Paris. And she had introduced him to some people in England who facilitated him, sent him a letter inviting him here for a holiday, which made it a bit easier for him to get through the immigration and try and make a new life here. So she remained loyal to her and her lovely husband, Carl. They used to always come on Boxing Day for pheasant and red cabbage, German red cabbage, which his mother taught my mother to make. So, yeah. My dad never really spoke about his early life in Germany unless he was deliberately questioned. And for quite a long time, it was something that we weren't really, the idea was that we weren't really supposed to talk about it. It was something so terrible that you just didn't mention it. And I can remember being about 6 or 7, or maybe maybe 8, and realizing my parents had lived through the war. You know, it dawned on me. But I didn't ask them anything about it, and there wasn't any conversation about it. But I think in my teens and later on, I did ask him a few times. I asked him, I asked him what it was like in Germany under Hitler, because I realized he left in 35 and Hitler was elected in 33. And I believe he'd actually witnessed the burning of the books. The people had been made to go out and watch it. And that had horrified him. And I believe he was once in a meeting, and at the end everybody raised their arm, and he just couldn't bring himself to raise his right arm. And for a week or 2 after that, he was very anxious in case somebody had told on him, but he was all right for that. I knew he had a group of friends. They used to go out for parties. So, he told me stories of how it was so cold one winter that his friend's ear had fallen off. I don't know how much he was joking because we were little children, but so I had the idea he had a group of friends and they had fun. And he really loved his studies at the music academy. He loved his professors. I think he could still remember nearly every word they told him. He would repeat phrases and things that his professors had told him from 40 or 50 years before. But he one time turned up for his music college and to go to his composition class, and his tutor had been removed. So little uncomfortable things like that were happening, and then his name was published in a book of Jews never to be given work. And so then that's how he realized he really wasn't going to be able to make a career, and it was time to go. So when he left Berlin, he left his mother and his sister behind. His mother was not Jewish. So, and his sister, I think, hadn't been published in any book and still felt that she would be all right. In fact, the last year of the war, I think my aunt, his sister, had been arrested, and she was tortured and made to clean the torture rooms. Her mother didn't know where she was for a long time, and I think my dad found out this afterwards because there was no communication between England and Germany in the war. So I don't know too much about all of that. But he also had a girlfriend who had helped him to cross the border, and I think she must have died during the war because they didn't ever see each other again. So after he left, he also then couldn't communicate for several years with them, and it must have been very difficult, I think. But he never mentioned that. I'm imagining that it would be difficult. I know after the war, he'd sent my uncle to try and find his mother, and he did find her, and my father was able to bring her over to England, and he moved into a flat in the Fulham Road with my mother and their little boy Martin, and she stayed with them until she died. I don't think she lived very long after the war. I never met her. His sister was in Berlin when the Americans arrived and liberated the police station, and they discovered her there, able to speak very good English. So she travelled with the Americans, liberating the camps and translating. And I think she fell in love with an American officer, and after the war, when it was possible to travel, she went over to America, and she lived in New York for the rest of her life. There were other Gellhorns over there who'd travelled to America in the previous generation. And so she had cousins there. Martha Gellhorn and her two brothers were cousins. And so she had some family. But I think this American was already married, so that was a bit of a blow. Although I think they kept in touch. I don't know. I think they kept in touch. My father had contact with his sister by telephone, and finally a visit was planned with him and my mother to go and see her in New York. I think about a month before the flight, my aunt, Annalisa, had to have a medical operation, a routine operation, but something went drastically wrong with it, and she died. And therefore, my dad never saw her since the days he left Berlin. They never met again. My dad's father was Jewish. He'd been an officer in the Prussian army, and he'd fought for the fatherland. So therefore, because he had been an officer, my father was allowed to continue his studies at university. But the day after Hitler's election, there was a knock on the door for my grandfather, who had already left his home, and he fled to Spain. He then went to Argentina for quite a long time, then came back to Spain, lived in Franco's Spain. I think my dad visited him once in Barcelona, where he lived, and he just couldn't understand why his father would live under a dictator. He found it very difficult. But then once my grandfather moved back to Germany, he would go and visit him fairly regularly. They exchanged letters. My grandfather had a new wife, well, he'd been married to her for years and years, so they were very happy together. And after Elsa died, that was his second wife, my grandfather also came to London and lived with us in East Sheen for a little while, and then just over the road with a German lady so he could speak German. And so my father and he were reunited again until his father died. He was an architect. He was a very brilliant, brainy man. And he was also very interested in modern art, modern music. He was part of the October group. And I think for those reasons, the Nazi regime was also very against him. So when my dad first came over to England, he was helped by a group of very liberal, generous people who found him accommodation, found him work, and some of those people also were lifelong friends. I didn't mention them before, but they were people from that time. There was Lord Robbins and his two children, Anne and Christopher. And there was Joe Hodgkinson, who was the director of drama at the Arts Council eventually. And they knew him from this very early time. And I knew, and he worked for a while. His first engagement was in Toynbee Hall. And he did talk about it a little bit in passing as a reference to when he used to live in the East End. He loved it there. He loved the Cockneys and their Cockney accent. He loved it. It reminded him of Berlin. That's one of the things he loved about Berlin, was their sense of humour. But also he was able to work very hard on his music at Toynbee Hall. He would copy parts, buy parts, direct things. He was able to conduct operas. And I think it was a very exciting time for him. In detail, he didn't really describe what it was like. I think he did maintain a connection with Toynbee Hall, but also with some of the other colleges in London. Morley College he used to work at quite a lot, and the opera players, and I don't know where the Carl Rosa opera was based, but and also the Guildhall and Goldsmiths College. So I don't know, he's had so many places where he worked. Really, he would be more likely to tell us which time the bus was or what time train he was getting than actually what he was doing. I've got some of his old diaries, and it's got lots of appointments in, but also at the side of it, you know, £1, 3 shillings for lunch, and how, you know, he was very meticulous about keeping his accounts and what times the trains were. Everything went in his book. All I really know about my dad's time on the Isle of Man is that in some ways it was a very rich time for him, because there were so many other talented people together in a small space with not much to do. So he wrote music, he played music, but I can remember there was one time in my life when I stopped dancing and I didn't know what to do really. And I could tell it was the voice of experience. He said, sometimes you just have to lie on your bed and look at the ceiling. I mean, he really had to just pass the time there. And he did say as well that sometimes it was quite cold and the lino on the floor used to flap. So that's really all I know about it. I think it was I think he was always interested in moving forward and leaving what happened before behind. When he worked in the factory, he, I think, had already married my mum, and they lived in, I think, Dolphin Square. I'm not quite sure. I think they did. So he used to ride his bicycle to work, and there was shift work, and he had to wait until the man came to take over from his shift before he came back. And one time a bomb had dropped exactly on the street where he would have been coming back from work, and I remember my mum was very distressed when she told the story. She just thought that was it. She went rushing out of the house. But that was the day that the man relieving my dad from his shift had been late, so all was well. He was measuring parts for bombers, for the aeroplanes, and he was meticulous. He kept a notebook with all the measurements in. And so I think, you know, whatever job he took on hook, line and sinker. And he in a way really enjoyed being a factory worker and just being with other people who weren't musicians. He had an exchange with a girl used to read lots of romantic novels. And she told him, "Oh, I've just found this a fantastic new book." And he looked at it and he said something like, "Well, that's not really my type of book." And she said, "Oh, I suppose you'd rather read a dictionary." My dad loved that. That was his sense of humour, you know, and he would have probably rather read a dictionary as well. You know, I actually don't know. I don't know how he did, but he had incredible drive, and he could work for 16 or 18 hours a day quite happily. And I think he just had an incredible amount of energy. So he wouldn't have ever not done music. Just fitted it in around his factory work. The way I remember the story of how my parents met, my mum had been an actress, and when they offered her her next role, she didn't like it very much. So her agent said, "Well, you've got a voice, you can sight read, why don't you go and try an audition for the Sadler's Wells?" So that's what she did. And when she arrived, they told her, "Well, I'm afraid Peter's not available at the moment, you'll have to have somebody else." So she was auditioned by somebody who reported back to Peter, my dad, "Oh, well, you know, she can sight read, she's got a good voice." And so my dad said, "Oh, well, you know, she's pretty, she can sight read, we'll put her in the chorus and somebody will probably marry her." And so that was the foresight that he had. That's, I think, before he met her. But they both said that they knew, as soon as they met each other, they sort of knew something was different. And they were married, I think, quite quickly, within a year, I think, of meeting each other. It was a very strong connection. On their wedding day, after the marriage, which was quite a low-key affair, although my mother, I believe, wore red, they had a lunch, and then my dad rushed off to conduct Traviata. The honeymoon was postponed. I don't know when till, but they did have one. So the first time my father was at Glyndebourne, it was before I was born. And he used to tell, he always loved being there. He knew Sir George Christie, who'd founded it, and his wife very well. He was a resident in the Glyndebourne house during the opera season. He had his own room. He worked with Abert, he worked with, oh, I can't remember the names offhand, it's just gone from my mind. But the people he worked with, he respected and talked about for the rest of his life. You know, the wonderful directions that they gave, how they followed the music in the opera to determine the movements. Usually he'd talk about that apropos of some opera he'd just seen, where a director had done something with the opera which given a twist to a traditional opera, and he used to hate that. He used to say if they want to do that, they should write an opera of their own. That's not how it should go. He's always very traditional in the way he liked his operas performed. I think when I was growing up, he was at the BBC, and he had an office on Great Portland Street, and I was allowed to go up, and I saw his desk and all the paperwork involved in it, and he was doing lots of recordings. So for the recordings, we didn't go and listen particularly, but whilst he was at the BBC, he also conducted half a prom, or some of the one prom, or half of one of the proms during the season. So we used to go to the Albert Hall for that. That was very exciting. And I remember I must have been about 6 years old, and I was introduced to Sir Malcolm Sargent, wearing his white suit. I was very impressed. So I think Sir Sargent was always very kind to my dad and very supportive of him. So I think he'd left Covent Garden when I was quite small, so I don't remember that. My dad never thought about retiring. He never wanted to retire, and he said if he could no longer play the keyboards, he could no longer do music, he didn't want to live. It really was his lifeblood. And even at the very end in the hospital, which he didn't leave, a keyboard was brought in for him, and he tried to play, and he really apparently he did play something to my mum, but that was, you know, he played right to the very, very end. I mean, towards the end of his life, his diary was not quite as full as it had been, but he always took work if it was offered. He always wanted to work, and he every year gave a piano recital of music of his own choosing and donated the money to the local choir. So he performed in old people's homes. Yeah, but it really, in a way, it saved his life, and it gave him a meaning to his life. It was his biggest passion, I think. My dad loved teaching because it was all about exploring music with somebody and bringing more out of it. So, and also he seemed to have a knack of being able to hone in on the one thing that would be useful to say for that person to make an improvement. And I think he liked the challenge of that as well, whether it was with the voice or with an instrument. It just was his way of finding more melody or more interest in any piece that the person had brought to work with. So he loved his teaching. My dad was a professional musician. My mum was the amateur musician. There's quite a difference in approach. And I can remember Dad playing at a family sing-song and pausing and correcting us for somebody not singing a G sharp, and the family's sort of collective eyebrows going, oh. But he conducted a local choir for 25 years, I think. And during that time, although he was very exacting and demanding, I think he learnt not to expect too much change between one week and the next. And also he was able to perform pieces that he'd loved and known. He chose the programs that we did. And I think that was a delight for him, to bring pieces out of a drawer somewhere that hadn't been done for a long time. So we did quite a lot of 20th century music, as well as the standard classics. And that was due to his great knowledge of music that had been written in the 20th century. I don't think he thought of his career as a great success. When you look at the CV and the places he'd been to, it looks fantastic. But there seemed to be a level of frustration and a little bit of gloom about him. For example, when he left Covent Garden, he'd been head chief of music staff, and instead of him being given the sort of next job up, somebody else was given that job, which he said there were too many Germans at Covent Garden at that time. He kind of acknowledged that. But it seemed to happen to him quite a lot in his career. And he'd conduct something and then look at the reviews, and maybe they weren't very good. So he seemed, I think, to look a little bit on the what hadn't happened rather than what had. You know, he'd play a piece, but he'd make one wrong note, and that would spoil it for him. So definitely in his 80s, when he was quite old, then I started to see him relax and get a bit happier. And he seemed to enjoy his playing more, and if he went wrong, it mattered less to him at that point. But all through his professional career, I think he was so demanding of himself that there wasn't great joy. It was quite hard for him. Not really. I just remember a time he was offered to conduct something with the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, but he already had an appointment in his diary, and he refused to change the appointment because he was such a stickler for sticking to your word. You know, so I think the thing he would have been most pleased of about his career was that he was true to his word, that he didn't ever compromise, and that he always did what he thought was right. And I think that would have given him some pleasure. Mm. So I knew he'd composed music for Lotte Reiniger's film, The Star of Bethlehem, because we watched that when we were small. But in 1972, my dad was commissioned to write a piece of music. And after he'd determined what it was going to be, he set about composing. And that was the first time I really had known that my dad could compose. And then he said, well, yes, I have written other things, and but all a very long time ago. So I asked him why he hadn't written anything for so long. And he said to me it was because no one had commissioned it, and he had to earn his living, and he was very busy. When he came to England, he had nothing. And then he just got on a sort of working ethic, and he just worked and worked. And I think he loved his work, and it didn't occur to him to write because he was very, very busy. I didn't get really any sense of what he had felt about his compositions. He was always very modest. He did say he'd wished that Baedeker had been done. He would have liked to have heard that. But he kept everything in meticulous order. But that was true of everything. All his programs, all his receipts, you know, all the cutlery, everything had its place in our house, and the compositions had their place too, but stacked away with lots of other music. I don't know for sure how all of his books and music got out of Germany, but I can only imagine that he came in '35 and that his mother must have posted them. I can't, because I've got copies of books and music with Hans Gellhorn, and I think if he was just crossing the border for a day trip, which was the story, he wouldn't have taken all of his things. So his mother or sister must have posted them. So one of the things we found in his room after he died was a box, and in it a medal. And it's from the music academy where he was, and he'd won the medal as the top student. The only thing I know about that is that I think as his leaving concert, he was allowed to conduct the Berlin Phil. And he invited his father to come and watch him conduct. So he must have been a graduate of some standing. But he didn't mention that to us at all. It's all pieces put together afterwards. Mm. Yeah, I think, you know, my dad was very political. And two of my friends who I've recently got back in touch with from my teenage years have both said how tea time at the Gellhorn house was a revelation. It had switched them onto politics and political thinking because he was terribly interested in it, and he was quite a humanitarian. And after he died, we found that his bank account was littered with standing orders to, you know, practical action, amnesty, all kinds of causes against torture and for human rights. So quietly in his way, he was busy supporting causes that he really believed in. I think when he was in Berlin, he'd been part of a Christian group who discussed Christian ideas. And he was not interested in the church and the politics of the church, but he really believed in his fellow man and in helping people. Politically, he was socialist, but I think he didn't always vote socialist just in order to not have a Tory. So I think my mum's influence on him was there. She was liberal. But I can remember him once picking up a hitchhiker and bringing him home, giving him supper and a bed for the night. You know, he liked people, and what he loved, I think, even in operas, was finding the person in the character. You know, he just was fascinated with that. And maybe, you know, he never finished his philosophy degree, but I think that interest was always there. What makes somebody tick? What makes somebody like that? And obviously the times that he grew up in Germany must have made politics really important. It was life and death in those days, in those times. So yeah, he brought a lot of that to the table. I'm really happy that this project about my dad is happening. Because at various times people have tried to help and promote him in his life, and always there seemed to be some kind of stumbling block. But this is really great that people are looking at his life and his music, and it just feels like a completion of all of the work that he did. So I'm really grateful to this project. It makes me very happy. I think he was quite shy, and that having his music, which is very personal, I can hear him in it, might have been quite difficult. But I think also he would have been quietly pleased that he was at last getting some recognition for it.